few years ago, I was renting a house in Northern California. The neighborhood was just outside the suburbs. It seemed like the perfect balance of having space and having nice neighbors close enough not to feel isolated. The area had no streetlights, so it was very dark at night, especially if there were clouds blocking the moonlight. It didn't bother me though, it made my little house feel even more quaint on dark nights. I got home from work one day in midwinter. It was a cloudy night, so pulling up to my house, I saw only what my headlights and front porch light illuminated. When I got out of my car, I caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. That was odd, as I had never smelled that before around that house. I didn't see anyone nearby, so I ignored it and went inside. I had just got off a shift with a few hours of overtime, so I felt pretty tired, even though it wasn't even 7 yet. I decided to take a shower and call it a night. I woke up sometime later, sure that I had heard a noise inside my house. I wasn't worried right away because my friend would sometimes stop by to use my shower after work on his way to his night classes, so I even gave him a spare key so he could stop by even if I wasn't home. He would always text me to let me know beforehand though, and I hadn't heard my phone go off. I reached over to my bedside table and picked up my cell phone to see if my friend had sent me a text. The bright light from my phone's screen and number pad blinded me. These were the days before phones had a light sensor that would dim the screen in the dark, and this particular phone was so bright I could use it as a flashlight. Through squinted eyes, I could make out that it was 9-something, but I couldn't tell if I had an unread text or not. I set my phone aside and called out my friend's name. There were a couple of seconds of silence before I heard loud footfalls as someone started running through the bottom floor of my house. I leapt out of bed and ran to the closet. They were already up the stairs by the time I had opened the door and stepped inside. That house had 3 rooms upstairs, 2 bedrooms on either side of the hallway, the one I was in, and a spare, and a bathroom at the end. The bedroom doors were both closed, but the bathroom door was cracked open. I heard whoever was in my house thunder down the hallway past my door into the bathroom. Thank God he did. That gave me enough time to open the attic access in the ceiling of my closet and hoist myself up. I just started to lift myself up when the person ran back out of the bathroom. My feet were barely inside of the attic when the bedroom door burst open. I heard footsteps run into my room and stop. When they didn't see me in that room, they ran back to the hallway and into the other room, which just had boxes stacked in a corner, some weights, and a table where I painted my miniature models. I guess they decided that if someone were hiding, it would be in the bedroom, because they charged back into my room and turned on the light. A moment later, the closet door was ripped open. I was crouched in my attic, just a foot or so away from the access, so I could try to stop them if they started to climb up. From my vantage point, all I could see was from about their knee down. They were wearing dirty blue jeans with frayed cuffs and worn work boots. After a few seconds of looking in the closet, they stepped away and I heard a loud crash come from my room, followed by the scream of frustration and anger. That scream was the most unnerving part of the incident for me. It reminded me far too much of my stepfather, who would scream in a similar way when he lost his temper. He would eventually be put in a mental hospital for several mental disorders that resulted in erratic and violent tendencies. I had left my cell phone when I ran for the closet, and I wasn't certain I could climb down without him hearing. After some time, the noises stopped. I started counting slowly. When I reached 1,000, I decided it was safe enough to climb down and call the police. The first thing I noticed when I exited the closet was the intruder had flipped my bed over. I assume in an attempt to find me. That was the loud noise I had heard after he stepped away from the closet. I couldn't find my cell phone, so I went to the landline by the bed and called the police. I waited in my room until I heard them call out from downstairs. The first floor was a mess, but I had expected that. Chairs had been knocked over, the sofa had been flipped, all the books, pictures, and knickknacks I had on my shelves were strewn across the floor. The cupboards in the kitchen had been opened and all the boxed and canned foods had been thrown to the ground. As far as I could tell, though, the only thing missing was a single knife out of the wooden block in my kitchen. The police checked the house from top to bottom. They found that the side door had been forced open by something like a crowbar. They also found a few cigarette butts along my fence line, along with some foil and an empty pen tube, which the police said people often use to smoke meth, so they think he'd been watching my house for a while. I realized that he must have been out there smoking a cigarette when I got home. They collected up the evidence and told me I should stay with my family or friends that night and get that door fixed as soon as possible. I opted to just not sleep. I moved a shelf over to block the broken door and spent the next couple hours cleaning things up. I would often go to the window with a flashlight and shine it along the fence line where the police found the cigarette butts and foil, but I didn't see anything. The next day, I called to have the door fixed and motion lights installed at the back and sides of my house. I ran a phone cable up into the attic and added a landline. I never wanted to be stuck up there without a phone again. Nothing else happened at that house, though. I lived there another 3 years without incident. One more precaution I took was practicing getting out of my bed, going to my closet, and climbing into the attic as quickly and quietly as possible. I even kept at it when I moved, especially now. I go to a crawl space at the back of the closet instead of the attic. I try not to think about what would have happened if I had been a bit slower getting to the attic, or if he hadn't gone into the bathroom at the end of the hall first. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe were outside all the time we could manage it. Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest, and my parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We'd only come out for school. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters, traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we got to be in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers, we discovered bridges no one went to, we fished, we hid from trains. At night we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. It was idyllic. In fact, it was so fun we did it multiple times and never had a problem. After high school, me and Joe went our own ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, it worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our Stand By Me trips. Well, nostalgia and beer are a hell of a mix. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. The day came, and we started out early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start right outside our hometown. She thought this was absolutely crazy and made sure to mention it. When she pulled away, Joe suggested that instead of walking the usual route, we'd take the opposite direction, just to be adventurous. We knew the land well, we had a map, so I gave a what the hell, and off we set. The day went fine. It was fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. Now, this is what we used to do in the old days, too. We'd walk the area around a little bit to make sure some dude's house wasn't just over a hill and we were actually camping in their yard. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom about 100 yards into the woods. It was barely visible. We pondered over what to do. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen, no lights. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a squat, sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, also weathered black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in. We didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to our spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness seeing a church in the middle of the woods would elicit. Besides, at this point it was dusk, and we decided just to rig up our hammocks and go to sleep and move on at early morning. Night set in, and as we lay our hammocks and shot the shit, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Our conversation about it went a little like this. Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing. And it did sound just like singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. We could still move very quietly in the woods from the old days. It was second nature to us. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree, but it was near pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill, and we didn't talk. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation that boiled down to, "Can you believe this shit?" The light looked to be a candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only saw occasional shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually it got to where the single male voice would say something and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It was so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, "Let's get the fuck out of here," when Joe put a hand on my shoulder and hissed, "They're coming out." We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out really well, but what we could see was a line of figures walk out the open doorway, all holding hands in single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move toward us in the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew it was a small town about 15 minutes down. We continued to walk there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all just thought it was kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. Not sure who those people were, but it was definitely the creepiest thing that happened to me out in the woods. I decided to write up this experience I had one time, maybe 15 years ago. Never told anyone about it before because there was no way they'd believe me. I used to live in a city not too far from the US-Mexico border, so authorities were a normal thing to see. Even in the night, it would be unusual to not see a patrol car go by every 15 minutes or so. Being in this type of city, I generally didn't go out by myself much without reason. I had heard too many stories of guys like me getting jumped, but this night was different. I had just had a fight with my mother who wanted me to move out while my income was unstable, and it ended up with me marching out of the house to clear my head. I must have been walking for close to an hour before I realized it was past dark and I was alone with nothing to defend myself. Once I realized that, I turned around and picked up the pace. I didn't want to get into an inescapable position out here. After half walking, half jogging for about 5 minutes, I realized something strange about my walk. I didn't remember seeing a single patrol car or even hearing one. That was when I started to think something strange must be going on, but at the time I chopped it up to a large-scale drug heist on the other side of the city. What triggered me to realize this, though, was a parked police car I saw parked in someone's driveway, presumably an off-duty officer. As I kept walking, I started to become uncomfortable very quickly. I was taking a route I was used to, the drive my bus would take to my high school before I graduated, but the route felt different somehow. I made an effort in my sophomore year to remember all the street names since I had a habit of missing the bus, but none of the street names I remembered were lining up. It felt like someone took all the street names and mixed them up. At first, I chalked it up to me being tired, but I was properly confused when I noticed a street name I knew I had turned off about 5 minutes prior. Now, I've never been known for my navigational abilities, but even when I'm tired, I'm not so bad as to walk in circles without realizing, especially in an area I know. Once I notice this, I start to backtrack, retracing my steps to figure out what happened. After about 3 minutes of walking, I noticed the same cop car parked in front of the house. That's when my confusion started to turn into anxiety. It had been close to 10 minutes since I had passed that house, but after only 3 minutes of walking, I was back there. And it wasn't just that. Throughout my walk, there had been people and cars, although infrequently. But since I turned back, the streets had been quiet. Hell, I hadn't passed a house that had its lights on. When I started walking again, I began looking around for any answers to what could have happened. Anything that seemed even remotely off, from strange lawn directions to odd vehicles my mind kept notice of. After what had to have been an hour of just walking and watching the same cars and lawn directions go past, I had had enough. Once I got to the same house with the cop car, I went up to the door and tried the doorbell. To my surprise, at that point, the doorbell made the traditional ring, but to my horror, what answered the door wasn't typical in the slightest. At the door was a man, or rather something that could be called man-shaped, the main defining feature of the entity being the fact that its skin was made up of countless faces, all seamlessly fused together and each one exactly the same. The glossy eyes all over the creature's body all stared at me. Many people in my situation would have started running, but at that point I was too exhausted from this whole situation to do anything but laugh. I was convinced this was a dream until this strange entity spoke, from each mouth echoing seamlessly, endlessly. It asked one question: "Why don't you come inside?" That's when I started running. As I ran, I looked around and saw from all the windows in the house I passed the same face on the people that were in those houses as the one that greeted me at the door. Eventually, I just closed my eyes. After about a mile of running, I stopped to catch my breath. I'm not one to claim to be in shape, but that night especially I was not up for running. When I looked up from my panting fit, I saw it in front of me. It was the same entity that answered the door, now standing in front of me. That's when I noticed behind it the cop car in the driveway. I began to step away, but that's when the worst part started. The laughing. It started laughing at me with all of its twisted faces with rotten teeth. The laughing didn't just come from it, though. It seemed to surround me, coming from all directions, and after a while of just the laughing, I was convinced that it was coming from inside my head as well. I couldn't take it anymore. "Shut up!" I screamed before I started running along the road once more, but the laughing just wouldn't go away. No matter how far I ran, I would stop and see that same fucking cop car and the same entity looking at me laughing. I'm not even sure it turned around or if it just had the same faces on both sides. After the 5th time seeing its ugly face again, I just lost it. I started running in a new direction. I turned and climbed over the cop car and jumped over the fence. In the backyard I ended up in, I saw 3 of the face creatures that were still laughing at me, so I climbed over the next fence. I started charging through yards. After the 3rd fence, I just closed my eyes when I saw at least 15 of the creatures around a pool in one backyard. I closed my eyes and covered my ears before running. I kept running, and eventually the laughing stopped. I stopped as well when I noticed and was greeted to the world again by the sound of wailing sirens. To this day, I don't know if it was a dream or if something strange really happened to me.